Tonight, we begin with warmth, but not the gentle kind. Not the sun on your face, blanket in bed kind. No, this warmth is molten, severe, unapologetic, and it comes in the shape of a red-hot iron rod, placed carefully, deliberately along your spine, because once upon a very real time, sadness was burned away, literally. People believed that melancholy, the old word for depression, wasn't just a mood, it was a substance, a dark, sludgy fluid clogging your insides, like tar in a pipe, sticky sorrow. And if it couldn't be cried out or bled out, there was one final solution. You heated metal, you pressed it to the back, and you hoped that grief had a melting point. This is not fiction. This is not metaphor. This was the cure. For priests who wept too often. For widows who forgot how to stand. For children who stared at walls. For soldiers who came home too silent. The diagnosis, it's gone now. The irons have cooled. The rooms are closed. The books are dusty. And the doctors, most of them, have stopped writing about fire. But something still lingers. A warmth, a memory, a tiny ember at the edge of thought. We live in an age of pills, of podcasts, of personalized self-care. We talk about trauma. We name our shadows. We light scented candles and call it therapy. And yet, there's still that flicker, that moment in the lowest nights when we wonder, what if I could just feel it all at once? Burn it out. Be clean again. It's not madness. Not really. It's a longing for reset. For some mythical switch that turns sorrow into steam. The people who used fire, they weren't fools. They just didn't have words. So they reached for heat. And now, we reach for other things. A walk. A poem. A hug that lasts longer than it should. A blanket that smells like someone we miss. These are gentle burns. Little flames. Warm enough to remind us we are here, but never hot enough to hurt. We've learned. We've softened. But we've also inherited the truth. That sometimes it takes something to move the sorrow. You don't need a brand on your back to prove you've suffered. You don't need a scar to say you've healed. You can just be tired, tender, breathing in the dark. And that's still a kind of treatment. So now, as your eyes grow heavy and the room thickens with silence, let it be enough. Let the quiet be your fire. Let your body be the iron. Let your dreams cauterize the worry, not with heat, but with stillness. The sadness is not gone. It never needed to be. It just needed space. To sit, to wait, to fall asleep beside you. And so, good night. You who did not burn. You who chose softness. You who made it here, to the end. Sleep deep. Sleep strange. Sleep without fire. You've earned that. It began, like all good disasters, with a theory. The ancient Greeks believed the human body was ruled by 4 fluids, called humors. Each one had a personality. Blood, warm and wet, full of life. Phlegm, cold and sluggish. Yellow bile, hot and angry. And black bile, the cold, dry, sticky sadness. Black bile wasn't just symbolic. It was real, they said, and it caused melancholy. Melancholy wasn't simply feeling blue. It was a full-body possession, a fog in the chest, a heaviness in the limbs, a constant return to grief without a reason, like your soul had developed gravity. You didn't just cry, you slowed. You forgot why you entered rooms. You slept too long and not enough. And for those around you, it was terrifying, because no one could pull you back. Not with words, not with touch. So they turned to fire. At first, they tried gentle things. Warm baths, hot stones, herbs that promised to evaporate sorrow. They burned incense meant to confuse the humors. They sang. But when the darkness didn't lift, they escalated. They believed black bile lived near the spine. It flowed like oil through the nervous river. So logically, you burn the riverbed. Let the bile boil. Let it run. One French physician wrote, "If grief pools along the back, then fire shall make it steam." Tools were created. Special irons, flat and narrow. Not for branding, not for cooking, just for the back. Some were simple, a rod you'd heat and press. Others had symbols carved in, crosses, sigils, letters of protection. Because if you're burning someone's spine, you might as well make it sacred. Patients lay face down on wooden boards. Their shirts were slit open, their backs washed with wine or brine. Priests would sometimes attend to pray the sadness out. And then the iron, glowing red, placed along the spine, sometimes quickly, sometimes held. The scream was part of the treatment, a sign that it was working, a sign that the sorrow was leaving the body. Not all patients screamed, though. Some went quiet, too tired, too gone. They'd lie there, eyes wide, as smoke curled from skin. Doctors called that a deep case, harder to fix, more fire required. Not everyone survived, but those who did were called lightened, not because they were cured, but because they could no longer carry the weight of sadness, or anything else. So that was the first step in the cure, to make the sorrow rise, to force it into steam, to brand the soul awake. Sounds cruel, but to them it was kindness. Better to suffer briefly than to drown slowly forever. And as sleep folds around you tonight, remember, your sadness is not black bile. Your spine needs no fire. You're safe, warm, and only this story will burn, gently. Before the fire came the mirror, not literal glass, but the reflection in others. You knew someone had melancholy not because they cried, but because they didn't. They moved through the world like smoke through a keyhole, there but not present, hands cold, eyes slow. Mothers noticed first, then neighbors, then priests. The cure began with a whisper. He carries the shadow. Sometimes the shadow passed. Sometimes it stayed. And when it did, treatments were creative. Herbs boiled in goat milk, honey smeared on the chest, snakeskin tied around the waist. Even laughter was prescribed, with traveling troops hired to perform in silence, while the patient watched unsmiling. If none of it worked, and it often didn't, the conversation turned to fire, not out loud. At first, only in suggestion. Has he considered the heat? The patient was consulted. Sometimes, other times not. Fathers made the choice. Husbands, physicians with strong mustaches and stronger beliefs. A few patients asked for it, not out of bravery, but exhaustion. They believed the fire might end the stillness, or end them. Either way, it would be an end. Those who agreed were given preparations. A final bath, a final meal, a final blessing, not unlike a funeral. And then came the table, not always a medical one. Sometimes it was the kitchen bench, sometimes the floor. One record from Vienna described a young man treated on a butcher's block. His sister held his hand. She burned herself too. The iron was not a surprise. They made sure you saw it, watched it glow. Some said that was part of the healing. To witness the danger, to fear it, to want something again even if it was escape. Because fear, they reasoned, was better than nothing. And melancholy was made of nothing. There were stages. First, the spine was mapped with charcoal. Doctors argued over where the soul root was. Some said between the shoulder blades. Others said lower at the small of the back. The braver ones tried both. Then came the pressing. not always searing. Sometimes it was just heat, a deep warmth meant to awaken the nerves. That almost never worked, so they pressed harder, deeper, until skin hissed and bubbled. The smell was unmistakable. Not death, not meat, something in between. One witness wrote, "It smelled like sorrow cooked." Some patients passed out. Some sang. One woman recited poetry through the pain. Her verses became famous. So did her scars. Recovery was ambiguous. Bandages soaked in vinegar. Backs wrapped in linen and silence. The patient lay face down for weeks. Some improved. Some never walked again. But for a few, something did shift. Not healing, not joy, but movement. They blinked more, ate slightly, stopped staring at walls. The doctors called it success. Others called it survival. But in a world where sorrow was poison and emotion was chemistry, the fire was seen as medicine. And those who carried the scars? They were not shamed. They were revered. So as your breath slows and your mind floats, know this. Even in the darkest cures, there was the glimmer of hope. Not kindness, but hope. And tonight, that is enough. It wasn't just the sick who were burned. It was the faithful, monks, nuns, clergy who prayed too long and slept too little. They called it divine melancholy, a sadness born of closeness to God, a weight placed by heaven, too heavy for the back to bear. And so the fire was blessed, sanctified, made holy. In some monasteries, iron rods were kept alongside relics. Right beside the saint's toe bone, you'd find a glowing ember cradled in a metal pan, used only in whispers, only when a brother wept through every prayer, only when a sister forgot how to sing. One record tells of Brother Thomas, kind man, gentle, silent, too silent. He stopped responding to sermons, stopped lighting candles. He walked like his robes were made of lead. They feared possession. They feared madness. So the abbot called for the iron. Brother Thomas agreed. He bowed his head. He lay flat on the chapel floor. He did not scream. They pressed the heat between his shoulder blades. His skin split. His robes caught fire. He did not scream. They said that meant the devil was leaving. 3 days later, he smiled. Once. That was enough. Stories like his spread. The faithful began to view the iron as a kind of divine test, a way to cauterize doubt, to remind the soul of its body. Some monks asked for it annually, like a spiritual reset, a literal burning bush. On the back, women were treated too, especially those in convents. Sadness in women was considered dangerous, more so than in men. They said a melancholic woman could rot a room just by entering it. Milk would curdle, flowers wilt, candles flicker out. Fire would fix that. It didn't always cure them, but it made them quieter, and that too was seen as healing. Of course, not everyone agreed. Some priests argued that true sadness was sacred, that melancholy meant the soul was growing. They wrote long letters, debated in Latin, but fire was easier to understand than poetry, and so it remained, even as science crept in, even as anatomy became less mysterious. The fire held on, because what else could you offer someone who had no language for their grief, no name for their weight? You offered them heat. You offered them a reason to feel something, anything again. And so the faithful burned, not in hell, not in punishment, but in treatment, with prayers on their lips and steam rising from their backs. Sleep now. Let the absurdity roll over you. Let the silence feel soft. You don't need relics or embers. You just need rest. And that, tonight, is sacred. They weren't always called doctors. Sometimes they were burners. Sometimes the he-men. Sometimes just him. The man with the gloves. The one with the iron box. He didn't smile. He didn't ask questions. He came when others failed. His tools were simple. A coal pan, tongs, irons of different widths, some flat, some ridged, some forked. And always, a small flask of something clear. Alcohol, mostly. Sometimes something stronger. Not for the patient. For him. The fire doctor was not a man of science. He was a man of certainty. He didn't believe in guesses. He didn't believe in invisible fluids. He believed in reaction. Touch something hot, you move. Touch it longer, you scream. Don't scream? You're too far gone. Simple math. Simple medicine. Communities called for him when a child stopped laughing. When a mother stopped speaking. When a farmer sat in his own field and didn't notice the rain. They said he was cruel. They also said he worked. No one wanted to be the one who called him. No one wanted to be the one who didn't. One story from a village near the Alps tells of a girl named Ilsa, 12 years old. Stopped eating. Stopped blinking. They thought it was a curse. The fire doctor arrived at dawn. He set up in the stable. He asked no questions. He only said, "When I'm done, she'll cry." Ilsa did cry. A long, rattling animal cry. Her back bore the shape of the iron for the rest of her life. But she also grew up, married, had children. They say she became a midwife. She refused to use fire, but she never spoke against it. She just said, "It brought me back." The fire doctors kept no journals, no manuals. They passed their methods down by demonstration. One hand on the patient, one on the iron. Never hesitate, never flinch. If you flinch, they feel it. If they feel it, they lose faith. And treatment requires faith, or at least fear. By the 1700s, some fire doctors tried to professionalize. They wore coats, carried notebooks, used Latin, but most still worked in barns, with soot on their sleeves, and burnt scars on their own arms, because you cannot play with fire without keeping some for yourself. They rarely stayed in one place. After the treatment, families wanted them gone, not out of anger, out of memory. To see the man was to remember the scream, the smell, the silence after. So he packed his coals, tied his irons, and walked on. These were not healers. Not really. They were interrupters. They stopped the sadness by shocking the system, like lightning in a snowstorm. It didn't fix the weather, but it changed the sky. And so tonight, if you feel heavy, if you feel dull, if you feel like your spirit is holding its breath, remember, you are not broken. You are simply still, and no man with fire is coming. You're safe here, warm but only gently. Sleep. Not all sadness was feared. Some sadness was admired. In certain circles, especially among the wealthy, melancholy became fashionable, a sign of depth, of soul, of intelligence too vast to carry lightly. They called it the noble sadness, a gloom reserved for poets, painters, and philosophers. Pale skin? Melancholy. Dark circles? Melancholy. Looking out windows for hours without blinking? Perfect. It became a look, a vibe. Portraits were painted with subjects gazing downward. Hand on heart, forehead gently furrowed. Not from pain, from meaning. There were perfumes for melancholy, scents meant to honor the internal cloud. They smelled like whetstone, old books, and violet. There were special couches, called melancholy loungers, designed to help you recline with maximum tragic elegance. And of course, there were tonics, black syrup in tiny crystal vials, labeled in Latin, mostly wine, a sip before bed, to keep the sadness soft. But even fashionable sorrow had its limits, because sometimes it stopped being beautiful. It slid past poetry, and into paralysis. That's when the fire returned. A nobleman in Florence had a room built just for melancholy. Padded walls, heavy curtains, a single iron rod mounted above the fireplace. Visitors called it his furnace of feeling. He called it relief. When his melancholia became unbearable, he'd lie face down on a marble slab and have the iron applied. Not by a doctor, by his servant, trained, silent. He wrote in his journal, "It hurts, but it narrows me. I return to the size of one man, instead of the size of the world." He lived to 72. He burned himself 14 times. This duality, admiring sadness yet fearing it, spread through Europe. Books were written. One physician published The Gentle Flame on the Regulation of Sorrow. Another, The Bile Within, a manual of heated therapy for the soul. They debated how much fire was too much. Some argued that permanent scars distorted posture. Others said that was the point. A scar made sadness visible, gave it shape, let others see the weight you'd carried. Of course, this was all about some people. The rich, the educated, the melancholy elite. For everyone else, sadness was just a problem. Not poetic, not romantic, just inconvenient. And inconvenient things were often solved with tools. Hot tools. So fire was both weapon and ornament, a blade to cut through darkness, and a torch to signal depth. You weren't just sad. You were willing to burn for it, and that made you someone. Tonight, as you lie still, and the darkness feels thick, remember this. You do not need to suffer to have meaning. You do not need to burn to be beautiful. You're allowed to feel heavy, and still be whole. So rest. Let the sadness be gentle. Let the sleep be kind. No iron required. The iron was not just for adults. Children, too, were seen as vessels of melancholy, especially if they didn't laugh, didn't speak, didn't play with the others. They were called the quiet ones, or the watchers. And in a world terrified of what it could not name, quiet was suspicious. Too quiet meant too much black bile, and too much black bile meant the fire must come. They were gentle at first, warm cloths on the back, songs, lullabies mixed with medicine. But if the child continued to sit in corners, to stare at walls, to cry without sound, then things changed. Mothers were torn, fathers were firm, and the doctors, they believed they were saving something, saving the child from themselves, from the fog, from whatever it was that made them unreachable. Small irons were made, tiny brands barely the length of a finger. They were called kindling spoons. Some were shaped like stars, some like suns, as if to remind the child, this pain is light. They were heated gently, not glowing red, just hot enough. The child was held, parent on each side, sometimes a priest whispering a blessing, sometimes nothing but the sound of fire and breath. The iron touched the lower back, or between the shoulder blades, sometimes both. They said children didn't scream the way adults did. Their pain went inward, folded, curled. That made it harder to measure success. So they looked for tears, shivers, the first spoken word. One boy in Prague said his first word, the day after he was burned. Cold. They called that a miracle. But miracles were rare. More often there was fever, silence, scars that grew as the child did. Some recovered. They learned to mimic joy, to pretend to laugh. Some didn't, and those who didn't were sometimes treated again. Because if the fire didn't work once, perhaps it just hadn't gone deep enough. One physician wrote, "Better to mar the skin than to lose the soul within." Another replied, "Are you so sure you're saving it? There were debates. Some believed sadness in children was divine, a sign of spiritual depth. Others believed it was demonic. Everyone agreed it was unnatural, and unnatural things, in the old world, had to be burned away. But there were exceptions. Grandmothers who wrapped their sad grandchildren in honey, healers who sang instead of seared, villages where no one ever called the fire doctor for a child. In those places, some of the quiet ones grew up, and when asked what they remembered, they said, "Nothing, just soft things, and the dark." So tonight, as the quiet folds around you, know this: not every silence needs to be fixed. Not every stillness is wrong. Sometimes, you are simply resting, and that is more than enough. The hospitals were not hospitals. They were houses, monasteries, sometimes just barns with locks, places where the melancholic were placed. When families gave up, or ran out of prayers, they were called asylums for the drowned mind, houses of the fogged soul, and sometimes simply the still house. There was nothing still about them. Inside, things were loud or very quiet. Too quiet. The patients rocked, wept, laughed at walls, forgot how to blink. The doctors tried many things: chains, cold baths, lobotomy by hammer, and of course, the fire. Hospitals had burning rooms, stone chambers with iron stoves, beds with straps, tools arranged like cutlery on white cloth. There was a schedule: Tuesdays and Fridays, heat days. Patients were selected by rotation, or by silence, or by how long they'd gone without speaking. Some resisted. They were sedated. Some begged. That was ignored. Others smiled. They thought the fire would end them. They weren't wrong, but it didn't always mean death. Sometimes it just meant the end of remembering. One woman, Elise from Lyonnais, was burned 7 times. Each time, her back split open like fruit. Each time, she returned quieter, until finally, she said only one thing: "The fire is a door." Not all doctors were cruel. Some believed they were helping. They truly did. They tracked results, wrote notes, created scales. Level 1, tears. Level 2, speech. Level 3, laughter. Level 4, escape. They rarely got past level 1. Eventually, governments noticed. Reports leaked. The public was horrified. There were protests, investigations, laws. The fire was banned. Hospitals closed their burning rooms. Irons were melted down. The ashes scattered. And for a moment, the world cooled. A fire has a way of returning. Not in hospitals, perhaps, but in homes, in private, in secret. There were still those who kept the irons, still those who believed that pain was a kind of prayer. And so tonight, in your own quiet room, wrapped in the warmth of your own breath, remember, you are not in a place of straps. No one will choose heat for you. Here, you are free, even in stillness, even in sorrow, even in dreams. They didn't wait for doctors, or family, or priests. They made the fire themselves, some out of desperation, some out of belief, some because they'd seen it work on others, and they thought, maybe this is what I need too. They used stoves, fireplaces, candles, the sun magnified through glass. Any heat that could be harnessed was seen as medicine. They called it the inward surgery, the inner exorcism. Some even had journals with sketches, instructions, measurements for how long to press the metal, how deep to go before it reaches the mood. One woman in Bohemia heated a spoon until it glowed, pressed it to the back of her neck. She wrote afterward. It hissed, And then I remembered my name. Another man, in Wales, branded his own thigh with a horseshoe. He said it kept the darkness in one place. These stories weren't published. Not in journals. Not in pamphlets. But they passed between hands. Letters. Whispers in kitchens. Tales told at dusk, when no one else was listening. She fixed herself with a kettle lid. He used the stovepipe, just once, and now he smiles. These weren't people seeking pain. Not exactly. They were seeking control. When nothing else worked, no tincture, no prayer, no love, they turned to the oldest thing they could hold. Heat, of course. Not all survived. Some burned too deep, too often, in places they couldn't reach again. The skin doesn't forget, and the spirit sometimes crumbles where the body scars. Eventually, these acts were labeled by new doctors, new thinkers. They called it self-harm, disordered behavior, evidence of mental collapse. And they weren't wrong. But what those new doctors didn't see was the logic inside the madness, the order inside the burn. Because to the burned, the iron wasn't chaos, it was structure. Still, the movement faded. As better treatments emerged, real ones, with fewer scars, the burning slowed. Spoons stayed on shelves. Iron stayed cold. People tried other ways. But in certain moments, still today, a few wonder, would it help? Just a little heat, just once. And they don't do it, but they think it, and then they sleep, because they've made it one more day, without fire. And that, in this world, is something hope. For a time, science fell in love with fire, not the romantic fire of poetry, but the measurable clinical kind. Thermal response, nerve excitation, skin conductivity, words wrapped around pain. To make it sound polite, they called it pyrotherapy, and they gave it rules. Surface temperature, 132 degrees Fahrenheit. Exposure time, no more than 12 seconds. Ideal location, thoracic vertebrae, zones T4 to T9. They wrote it on charts. They taught it in schools. Suddenly, the burn was no longer mystical. It was prescribed. Doctors wore goggles, held thermometers, timed pulses. The iron wasn't just heated, it was calibrated. No more fireplaces, now sterile burners. No more screams, now observed vocalizations. And when patients wept, they wrote, therapeutic release observed, intensity moderate. In one famous study, 2 groups of patients with melancholia were tested. Group A, no treatment. Group B received controlled dorsal cauterization. Group B showed increased verbal responsiveness, but also a 12% increase in suicide attempts. The paper concluded, pyrotherapy shows promise with noted risks. No kidding. Hospitals built wings for it. Thermotherapy units. Doctors with names like Van Gassen and Ricciardi became famous for their branding patterns. Literally, the Ricciardi loop, the Van Gassen fork. Some patients collected them, like medals, like evidence. They wore their scars with pride, until they didn't, because soon, the results began to crack. Too many relapses, too many infections, too many lawsuits, and the questions began. Why are we burning people? To prove they can feel. Is that really treatment? Or is it just cruelty? With a thermometer, pyrotherapy was discredited. Slowly, quietly, not with outrage, with boredom. People stopped caring. moved on. The fire was placed in a museum. Literally, a single iron rod, mounted behind glass, with the plaque, used in therapeutic practice, 1883 to 1912. Purpose, emotional stimulation. Outcome, mixed. And yet, some therapists today, in whispered corners of the world, still light candles during sessions, still keep warm stones in drawers, still talk about the heat of memory. The fire never left. It just changed names. So as you lie here, not in a clinic, not in a hospital, but in your own bed, under your own sky, know this: you are not data. You are not an experiment. You are not an outcome with a margin of error. You are a person with feelings and tired lungs and the right to simply rest. So do